to be able to host Tim Bolton here. Tim is the Vice Principal of Plymouth College of Arts, and I had the great pleasure of visiting Plymouth College of Arts and the School for Creative Arts that Tim's also going to be talking about really recently, like a couple of weeks ago. And as some of my students will know, I came back positively buzzing about this and thinking that there were brilliant things about the free school, which sort of didn't sit particularly well with the kind of things I normally say. So the idea that perhaps we could be doing something interesting with a free school is something that I think we should all be having a chance to listen to. And so Tim's going to be talking you through the motivation for that school and a bit about how it operates with the art college. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Great.
I'm going to be a slide operator. Hopefully I'm on cue with that. Sorry, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Claire. And it's interesting, kind of sitting here doing a presentation. I nearly always stand up and press the buttons myself, but to fit into the camera, I'm doing it. Yeah, I haven't got a long enough arm, so I'm trying to fit in down here. So. Thanks very much for asking me to come along, and as you said, the plan really is just to try and talk through a little bit about who we are as a college, because I think that's part of where the free school comes from, and some of the freedoms we've allowed ourselves, so perhaps part of the reason why the Plymouth School of Creative Arts was made in the first place, and then some things about the motivation, the process, and the kind of pedagogy that exists there. It is absolutely a making project, and we're still making it, we're still trying to understand it. We're still trying to learn what it could be capable of. We're learning some things that we shouldn't do again. That's part of making anything, I think, isn't it? So we'll see if we can head on. So perhaps if we could go to the first slide. Okay, so really in the background of these, I'm just going to project some images of some of our buildings and then some of the school, and then at the end we'll have a short film, which I think lasts about 7 minutes, something like that, which will hopefully give you a bit of an oversight of the space, and is more about the space of learning perhaps than it is anything else, but it will give you a strong sense of the institution. So I think first of all, as I was introduced, I'm the Vice Principal of Plymouth College of Art. Plymouth College of Art is one of those rare beasts. It's an independent art school. It was part of the FE sector up until 3 years ago when it became a higher education institution. And at the point that I joined it, I've been there for quite a while now. I've been there for almost 15 years. It had about 300 undergraduate students and about 600 pre-degree students, so students doing extended diplomas, foundation courses and so on. Now it's about 1,300 undergraduate and postgraduate students, about 600 still pre-degree students on foundation and extended diplomas, and about 2,500 enrolments on other courses that sit around that, which include things like the Saturday Art programs. We have 250 young people in the institution using all of the resources of the institution on a Saturday morning between 9 and 3:30. So it's not a kind of an hour and a half long class. This is an immersive experience where we heard earlier on in the 45-minute idea, you just about get time to take out the paints and put them away, and then you might think about making some work in the middle, but there's not much time. But these are immersive experiences that the students really enjoy. So because we're an independent art school, we're really, in some ways, not answerable to anyone. Now, that obviously is a fib. There's the QAA, there's Ofsted, there are funders. But actually we can make decisions on the fly. And I think we saw an awful lot of things happening in the curriculum in Plymouth, but I think we also knew they were national issues that we weren't sure about and couldn't quite see how that was productive for our students. And we were seeing the outcomes in the students who were coming to us. So we saw lots of students who didn't understand anything about ambiguity, were constantly chasing grades, wanted to know what they needed to do in order to improve that grade, not wanting to know what they needed to do in order to become better practitioners or in order to make this a more interesting outcome. They just wanted to know how to improve the grade. And we thought there was a sort of a fundamental problem in terms of this. So we, if I go back one stage, in fact if we flip on another slide, Claire. As many of you were talking about earlier on, both art design generally, and I think particularly FEHE, has had a really interesting input around widening participation over the last few years. My own background, years ago I worked with various colleagues here in Richmond Adult Community College, which is a really interesting institution in terms of the number of people returning to education, having been out of it for a long time. I've worked at Plymouth with groups of students who were excluded from school with young people who had offended, who were being kind of rehabilitated back in, and you could see that through creative subjects they were suddenly finding a way to communicate, a way that they could get some self-esteem, which hadn't been part of their life up until that point, certainly hadn't been part of their educational life up until that point. And so one of our conversations was, why do we need to wait until people fall out of the system before we then rehabilitate them? How can we move forward? And there's that famous Picasso quote about everyone's born an artist, and the tricks to remain an artist as you grow older. And we wanted to try and foster that. I'm a parent. I've got I've got 3 children, but 2 of them are twins, which means that you really see some of the problems that are happening in schools. So, for instance, come the report writing, I get reports that are identical for my daughters because they're using the same set of words in the report, which they're using as a kind of ready reckoner to drop in. And all of those kind of interesting things, and you think, really, do you actually understand my child at all, or do you understand any of the children that you've got with you? So we felt we had quite a lot of knowledge about widening participation. We felt we had quite a lot of knowledge through our Saturday Arts about the way in which lots of young people were finding engagement in creative subjects was of a powerful force for them. And as I say, the young people who were coming to us who had a total lack of openness, target fixated, and that was both for our pre-degree courses and our undergraduate study. So we perceived that to be a local and national issue. And this kind of teaching to the test, which was being increasingly made worse by the EBAC, and that's, I think, continued to ramp up since we started this process. So this is 2011 we started to talk about it. Our extended diploma students on numerous occasions have sort of said this, which it's different here at school. At school they just teach you how to pass exams. Here you have to think for yourself. And that's incredibly important for us. We really wanted students who are going to be active participants. So as a discussion in our senior management team, we sort of started joking that the way to deal with this obviously was to use Gove's free school initiative against himself, to create something that he would absolutely loathe, a creative free school that was against every government policy you could possibly imagine. After we'd been talking about it for a little while, we all realised we weren't really joking. We were all quite interested in the project, and one of the things which is interesting about being small is that we actually had the freedom to do this. So we started having a conversation with our governors, and this was December 2011, and within about 2 weeks we'd managed to persuade our governors that it was worth us spending a bit of time doing it. And I think we thought, even if we couldn't actually launch a free school, and we thought it was in lots of ways probably quite unlikely, we thought that the process of looking at this and examining it would be useful for us in terms of understanding how we might change our own curriculum and how we might modify the way we engaged with local schools. We'll go on to another slide. So December 2011 we decided to go for it. At the end of January 2012, so just a month later, we had to submit a 180-page application form. In May, we were asked to go to Whitehall in order to go and defend this document, and interestingly, we thought it was going to be a real battle. And not everybody gets to go to Whitehall in the first place, so we were surprised to be asked. We thought it was going to be a real battle when we went in. And the first thing they said to us, they had this enormous pile of paper in front of them, and we could see a letter from Nick Sirota on the top saying he thought it was a great idea. And we thought that's really useful. But the first thing they said to us was, actually, no, we completely understand the pedagogic case, that's not a question. So they then proceeded to ask us various questions about the demographic in our area and so on, as opposed to anything about the nature of the school, so which was fascinating. In June it was announced that we were successful, and in September the year after we opened the school in temporary premises. So it's a 4 to 16 free school. In fact, we've since started a preschool, so it's now 3 to 16, and we're in the process of starting to write a 6th form for it because of its very particular kind of pedagogy. It has, when it's full, we'll have about 1,200 pupils, and at the moment it has about 750, something like that. The school starts in temporary premises which look down over the building site that the new building was being made in, and the children in reception year 1 and 2 use that as their main vehicle for maths inside the first year. So they were working with the quantity surveyors and with the architects. They measured all of the bricks. They talked about catenary arches and the way in which structures worked. They started to look at engineering principles using that as a very particular model. And I suppose that's part of what the pedagogy of the school is, but perhaps I'll come on to that in a moment. If we go on to the next slide. and the next one as well. Thanks. Right, so this is the building, and I'll show you some more buildings in a moment. It's called the Red House, and it's very deliberately called the Red House because we didn't want to call it something or other school. And that's partly because we wanted people to re-engage with education. And the second you call it school, people are reluctant to cross the threshold if they didn't have a great experience first time. And it has become a real community space, but perhaps I'll try and cover that a little bit later. Our initial plan when we were first going through the process of writing it was to use a disused department store right in the centre of Plymouth, which was an amazing building, a really lovely 1940s sort of utopian notion of what a department store should be. But sadly, we just couldn't get that through the process fast enough. Also, the DFE had a very strict rule. If you have, if you say you're going to have 1,200 pupils, you get exactly this number of square metres, no more. And that would have been far cheaper for them to give us the whole building, but it was twice the space we needed than it was in the end for them to build this building. But them's the breaks. We wanted big open spaces, and so when we eventually found this brownfield site, which again was right in the space we wanted, so this was always meant as a project that was going to change the community it sat in. It was going to enhance the community it sat in. So this is right in the heart of the poorest area of Plymouth. It was one of the main kind of turning circles in the red light district, and it started to really change that area, but perhaps cover that a bit more. So the architects, when they came to meet us, said, what your ambitions were, and we said, actually, what we'd quite like is a department store that we could occupy as a school, because by that point we'd become obsessed about the idea that you had glass walls, people were going to be able to look in and see this activity happening. You could kind of see the machine that was the school operating at any moment, and if you sort of see bits of the college, that's exactly the way we've designed the college effectively. It's a sort of an open box that you can look into. And luckily they went with us. The architects were Field and Clegg Bradley, great, and just went with us. So we wanted as many big open spaces as we could. Most of the year groups are taught together as single year groups, and that allows us to break down the complexity of the timetable. There was discussion earlier on about the way in which the timetable completely hampers learning. Opportunities arise and you can't do anything because you've already got a rigid timetable. So we wanted to make sure we broke some of that down. In Gove's austerity schools, you only got about a third of the budget you would have done under Building Schools for the Future, which was the scheme that the Labour government were rolling out at the point they were moved on. So that meant that the architects had to be incredibly inventive. One of the things that did happen, because we went for this open plan structure, was that all of the corridors became teaching space. But actually the architects were able to pass them off as corridors. So it meant that actually we got about 1/3 as much space, again, as we were supposed to get through this process because of all of the transition spaces. It also means that if you walk through the school, you walk through everyone's work. You walk through the classes that are happening. There aren't any doors that are shut. You can't sort of say, this is my private teaching space, I'm going to lock the door on it. It has lots of issues around sound because of that, and I'm sure most of you are probably have experience of working in buildings that have been designed like this, and they're great in lots of ways, but they come with problems. But it largely works. So the pedagogy. We based the pedagogy on what we perceived to be the pedagogy of an art school, and I suppose that was the starting point. So my image of an art school, my image of an art school, I suppose, in terms of our fine art curriculum, and this is a gross generalisation, but perhaps you'll go with me, is that we put people in a simulated garret and we ask them to behave as artists almost from the start. And that's exactly what we wanted to do with the students. We wanted them to be active researchers, not passive consumers. We didn't want to be topping them up with knowledge. We wanted them to be finding things out. So most of the conversations you'll find happening in the school, right from the very early primary age, are about how would you know, how would you find out, what do you think this is? And then how would you check that? And given everything that's been happening politically over the last year or so, these are some fundamental skills that perhaps all of society might look for. And that we hope is going to encourage, and I think it is bearing fruit, those students to be excited, motivated, knowledgeable, but have agency in the future and be able to find the solutions to the problems they see in front of them, not just to be able to recite the stuff they know they need for this test. And one of my daughters is at the moment doing English Lit and was given a really interesting book and told she only needed to read chapter 1 and chapter 7 because that's where the questions were. And you just, anyway. Makes you despair slightly. But it may well be exactly where the questions are, but I'd still wanted to read the whole thing. The other sort of big influences were things like Reggio Emilia and Montessori. Reggio Emilia, I don't know how many of you know about it, but it comes out of Italy immediately post-war. And one of its main themes is around the teacher as facilitator, not as walking encyclopedia. And that's incredibly important. So it comes back, I suppose, to that question about how would you know. We don't want the students to be led through this. We want them to lead their own learning and for them to discover intrinsic motivation in their own learning so that they're looking for the next answer. They're not waiting for break. And there are loads of other things. So we looked at Michelle Obama's 21st Century Skills, about habits of mind, problem solving, critical and creative thinking, dealing with ambiguity and complexity, integration of multiple skill sets, the ability to perform cross-disciplinary work, all of these things which we thought were incredibly important. There are other things like Cultural Learning Alliance and a whole range of different other sources as well as theories. So maybe if we move on to the next slide. So, as I said earlier on, it was designed as a catalyst for community transformation as well as being a school. The area it's in is in one of the 10% most disadvantaged neighbourhoods in the country. It has community safety issues, including those relating to drug abuse, prostitution, alcohol abuse, and so on. And it's one of the highest levels of deprivation in the city. And Plymouth's a peculiar place. It's absolutely beautiful. It's right on the border between Devon and Cornwall. Just with a river dividing it, and I can look out of my office window and see the banks of Cornwall on the other side of the river. It's a beautiful place, but it's one of the poorest cities in the country, and if you look at the kind of statistics for it, it looks like a northeastern city that's been grabbed and dragged round and dropped off on the southwest coast. It's changing quite quickly, but that's its kind of background, and this is right in the heart of that area. So one of the points that we were really keen on was, and I think when we're talking about it as a creative school, it's creativity in the broadest sense. So we're trying to teach maths creatively, we're trying to teach English creatively, and so on. So that it's not just that they do more art and design. They do more art and design than most school children would, and more music and more dance. But it's actually their whole approach to education is creative. And so one of the pieces that we wrote, which I'll just read out quickly, was around food. And because of, as I said, the neighbourhood where it is, I think one stereotypically might assume, and I think this is borne out by evidence, that there's very little cooking that takes place there that begins with fresh ingredients. They normally, it comes from tins and so on. There's very little knowledge about food there. And so culinary art was a really important thing for us, and it takes over a large chunk of one floor, and all of the students do culinary art, whether they like it or not, but in fact it is the most popular subject. But right from the beginning, when we when we wrote to get the school, we wrote this into the document, which is, food is creativity and practical understanding. It's nutrition, health and culinary art. It is craft and economics, design and entrepreneurship. Food is history and geography. It is culture and language and performance. Food culture is fundamental to human identity. Cuisine is teamwork and business and mathematics, applying laws of chemistry and biology and physics. Food culture is profoundly social and draws upon long centuries of diverse traditions. It is ethical and industrial, embodying enduring values of quality, service, hospitality, ecology, aesthetics. It is global knowledge. It engenders essential skills for living. So that's kind of, there were lots of these in particular relation to different areas of the curriculum, but that's the kind of the approach, I think. Interestingly, the culinary arts is taught by somebody who was a Michelin-starred chef, and they teach culinary arts in French. So they're doing 2 subjects simultaneously. And nobody were down there. We talked about the fact they were just about to go off on another cruise. So
did you say he was a TA then?
Yes, he started off as a TA, yeah. So, but just across the road from here is the ferry port, and so they walk to the ferry port, go to Roscoff with a shopping list, and they come back having been around Roscoff to all the markets, having bought all of the stuff, and then they lay on a feast for all of the other pupils the day after, which is just, it's a great project. So, really good. So some of the things we were doing, so just mindful of time, some of the things we were doing in terms of the curriculum, we made school days longer, partly because we thought there were a whole set of things that nice middle class kids got access to that these kids didn't. And whether that's guides and brownies or scouts or making fires on the beach or whatever it was, a whole set of things. We also wanted to make sure there was a lot of art, design and making in here, but we still have lots of other curriculum we need to get into the day. The last thing we want at the end of this project, at the end of year 11, the students take their GCSEs, at the end of that, people not to get GCSEs. They will get good GCSEs, they just won't have done it through the usual route. We wanted them to be able to access all of these different bits of learning which they weren't going to be doing at home when they left us. So it was sort of down to us to try and fit it into the day. We included a thing called the 10th day, which some of you may have come across before. So every 10th day in the curriculum is untimetabled at the beginning of the year, and then we find things to do in the 10th day. So, and that means that we can do things across the whole school. It means that the kids can all come to the college. In line with some of the questions earlier on, we quite often write out to all of our schools saying, why don't you come in and do a project? You come and do some glass blowing with, any year in your school or whatever. Come and have a day in the art college, and the amount of take up is tiny, absolutely tiny. And largely the response we get is that the timetables have already been set. We say, no, we can do it in 6 months. Yeah, it's too tricky. So we wanted to get away from that sense, I think. So the 10th days are really good. And then at the end of every term, there's also a thing called a making week, where the students work together or on their own or collaboratively between years, or sometimes with our pupils our students from Plymouth College of Art, on a range of different projects, from making websites to we had a group of students who had decided they had an interest in a particular kind of material, and they contacted people at MIT and started doing a collaborative project with MIT about materials with thermodynamic properties, and anyway, all sorts of different kinds of projects. So I suppose part of that comes on to, thank you. Part of that comes on to how we work together. So we continue to work as one institution, despite the fact we're 2 separate institutions. Lots of our undergraduate and postgraduate students spend time down at the Free School doing things with the students. One of the main benefits there is that, for instance, there's a radio station down at the school, and they also make films. For them to have somebody who's just finished making a film, one of our recent graduates, who's working on a film, working in an office down there, or perhaps working in the same space as them, they suddenly start to think that film isn't an unrealistic expectation in their life. They could become a film director because they know one. It's not some kind of Steven Spielberg that they've read about somewhere. It's actually, it's John just down the corridor. And the same is true of most of the other practices. There are lots of sort of really practical things our students do. So, for instance, our commercial photographers do all of the the pupil photos, which they then sell back to the parents, and that's one of the ways they pay to go to Truman Brewery every year for their degree show. So some really practical propositions as well. And learning from each other. So this is the last bit, and then we could have a film. So learning from each other, I think one of the things which has been really fascinating is when we started this, we thought we knew, this was so big-headed, we thought we knew everything about this. We could set up a school with an art school pedagogy, and wouldn't that be great? What we've discovered is we've learned so much more from the process, I think, ourselves as an institution. It's constantly changing the way in which we drive our learning and teaching. And I think that's everything down to the notion of how important is facilitation in our undergraduate and postgraduate teaching staff. I think if you look at most jobs that are advertised in higher education, people are looking for subject experts, really strong subject experts. Very rarely will you see anything in there which is about facilitation skills. But I wonder what value subject expertise is some of the time. Maybe just a bit contentious. How do we build habits of mind in our pre-degree and undergraduate students? Because it's certainly that the students we've got at the moment in the school have a completely different approach to their learning to the students we now have in our pre-degree. And so there's lots of questions now about how we help to build character and grit and determination, and move students away from that target fixation about how can I improve my grade to something which is a more holistic approach to how can I become a better artist or fashion designer or filmmaker. And then I suppose there's some really practical things like the individual learning plans that the school have developed, the way in which they are now informing the way we work with our PDP kind of plans, personal development plans, with our undergraduate students and pre-degree students. And even that's now affecting the staff appraisal form, and that kind of sense that actually we're all on a journey supporting each other to become better. And there's a kind of a strong kind of cyclical element going through. So that's probably enough from me, and I think maybe there'll be a chance for some questions in a moment, won't there? Perhaps if we go on to the next slide, and I'll just try to start up with Phil, which no, it's the right, so this one, sorry. We'll get there in a minute. Hopefully it's loud enough. This was made by the architects, kind of advertise their wares, but actually I think it's quite a good indication of the kind of place the school is.
Coincidence, not our school. Well, so very connected to our community is, in fact, a box, brazenly, beautifully red. Perhaps the architect selected quite deliberately a paradox, a shape that could contain, but would release.
That could confine, but would emancipate. As the Ruby Hughes pulsate, the issue of command.
Enter, inquire, inspire, create, investigate.
The Red House, as it's affectionately known, has become almost the heart of its local community. Now it's located in Mill Bay, which is down in the docks in Plymouth. And the brief was a school of the creative arts, something that absolutely put creativity at the centre of all subjects. A conversation that came out of a master planning discussion that we were having with Plymouth College of Art, in which Andrew Burton, the principal, hatched this idea that actually wouldn't it be amazing that there was more of a continuum within the city.
This idea that an art college would create a school in which the approach to learning in all subjects was through making arose as a response to things that were happening nationally in terms of education policy, and also in response to local need.
We didn't really understand quite how wonderfully experimental it was really going to become. Could it be like a gallery, which would make it really exciting? Is it a theatre, in that there's performance going on? Or is it actually just a series of wonderful studio workshop spaces? And so a hybrid of all of those kind of space types came together to create the basis for the school.
I remember the extraordinary moment when Andy very nervously prepared us for the image that he was about to show us, and then this bright red box appeared. We stared at it for a long time. And nobody said a word. And it just looked right. The restrictions in terms of what we could afford meant that it had to be a box. What Andy and the team created was this highly perforated box, at the centre of which is this huge well of light.
So the building is based on the idea of a superblock, but it's not just a basic superblock, it's a sculpted superblock. Up at high level, we've taken away the odd corner, and then we've coloured that differently. So instead of the chilly red, we've used a black anthracite just to express where the building's cut. It's not quite a Barbara Hepworth, but it's along those lines where the extracted forms are then coloured differently. So it takes on a really sculptural quality.
It feels bigger on the inside than it looks to be on the outside. There's virtue of all of these amazing perspectives we have from these huge picture windows. And if that's the physical dimension, it's also the imaginative dimension, because the two things are inextricable.
The space facilitates that openness, that sense of community. So many people come around and connect to the fact that it doesn't quite feel like a school. That sense of community and diversity in it is one of the most compelling aspects of why magical things happen here. So if you're a young person who is connecting to sport, and then you've got Plymouth Raiders working and training in the building and reading to our children or having lunch with our children, there's a different quality to that, there's a different authenticity to that. What we're finding with the open plan space is a sort of series of things of how those spaces provoke learning, not just of the students, but of the staff.
One of the big elements of working in a space like this is that it's completely transparent. Your practice is transparent, there's nowhere to hide.
Kind of shifts the dynamic of the way that staff work with each other, they learn from each other, but more importantly then shift into believing in people rather than feeling like all being controlled sort of thing. And the space is absolutely pivotal in that, really provokes a necessary and different response.
We absolutely reject the idea of art or creativity as a boundaried subject. How is language made? How are ideas made, or how is food made?
How does the cooking in school help with, like, life?
It's taught me how to live and how to just be creative with whatever I make. And that can be with food, but that's also to do with anything else.
This, in fact, is part of their English work. But after half term, we're going to be looking at Macbeth, the modern landscape against which it happens, the dark, gloomy castles of the time, and the weather. The point about drawing is it's about learning. It's not about making art. It's very much about learning. So drawing is a process of learning in the same way as writing can be. As a way of recording, inquiring, illustrating. This is essentially looking at literature through drawing.
Each child in our school has an individual learning profile, and you get to learn everything about them. With this cohort, they all love animals and they've all got quite a few pets, so we decided that it would be a good topic to look at and try and link all our learning around their interests.
So what are we doing this afternoon?
Well, we're making the path to Olympics.
Why are they going to have a carrot then?
Because they might get hungry. They might get hungry at the end.
The Annual Olympics project allowed us to make our maths and our English really purposeful. They did data handling to see what pets we could invite. They really enjoyed looking at food chains because they were talking about having a pet snake in at the same time as having somebody's rabbit and somebody's pit bull dog. So they went away, looked at food chains and came back and said, we can't have those on the same day. So then they decided they would have to have separate events.
The purpose of the school in terms of Equipping for Life is to shift that idea in students' minds of them being consumers to makers.
They know they're experimental, they know they're on the edge. But what it's created is a school that I think all of us would want to send our children to.
It's really clear when you talk to the children, when you walk around the place, there's a real drive and sense of purpose. It hooks right back into that transparency of the space, because you can see it and feel it and hear it and connect to it, taste it all the time.
I think we're on an amazing journey. We're really keen to understand where they're going to take that journey. I'm not sure they quite know exactly where the journey's leading them to. In fact, it seems as if the building has enabled that experiment to go much further than we imagined.
pass over now to you for some questions. So anybody got questions for Tim? We're going to do the catch box thing again.
I'd just be interested to know what behaviour is like, and if it has changed. Hopefully, I would think for the better, but has it changed significantly or not from the school, the local school that the students were in originally?
Yeah, in fact, most of the
Box back. Box.
sorry.
Oh.
So all of the primary are from the primary. So they started out from reception, effectively, in there. And I think everybody comments on how beautiful, exemplary the behaviour is. And I think that's also partly because it's a big open space. So really shouting and screaming just isn't possible. And so they've had to be really on top of trying to make sure that everybody behaves in a courteous way. But it's an incredibly courteous place. As I wander around it, people are holding doors open for you and so on. It's a really friendly place. It's less easy for those pupils who come from somewhere else. So the way the school works is there are 60 pupils who come into reception year 1 and 2, and then it suddenly doubles in size at the point when it goes into the secondary school. So there will only be 60 pupils coming in from our own school and 60 brand new. Now that hasn't happened yet. That will happen next year, is the first point when that will happen, and that will be really interesting to see quite how they get on. I think the pupils who came from other primary schools somehow suspended their disbelief, I think, as they walked through the door, because they came from quite a wide range of schools, so it wasn't like one clique coming in. And so actually they've learnt a culture together. That will change in that largely, as the school's profile is building, the area from which the children are coming has shrunk, and so now if you're not within half a mile of the school, you can't get in. So actually they probably will come from 1 or 2 primary schools, the extra 60, and I think that we might find all sorts of interesting issues there. But things like truancy, we've got quite a number of people who are really persistent truants at the point they came to us, and they were close to going into various different kind of special institutions the council's kind enough to run. And they have really turned that round, and now their attendance is great. So. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I've kind of got an answer from what you said about the catchment area. I just wondered how did you need to sell this to the community, because it's quite a radical vision. Did you sell it as a radical vision or just as a new school? And I just wondered how the community accepted you or were interested, or I'll have to chuck it back.
Thanks. It's quite useful, this chucking back, gives you a chance to think about the answer. When we first came up with the idea, one of the things you had to do as part of the application was to show that there was a need, that there were enough parents with children who were interested in the project. So we had lots of public consultations, and actually we had people from two different families from Australia who signed up to come to the school when it first started. They were still in Australia at the time, and in fact they were 2 streets away from what Dave was saying the other day, but they were completely unaware of each other. So they came from very far afield in the first instance, and we, I suppose, thought that might be the case, that actually people would come from a distance. Within the first year, that had come down to sort of within 10 miles of there, and by the second year it was within a mile of the school. I think there was one of the things which we wondered about when we first invented it was it going to be lots of nice middle class kids coming in their Land Rovers and being dropped off in the morning because they all bought into the idea. And there was no way that you could make a free school selective. There was no way we wanted to make the free school selective, but there was no way that you could make the free school selective. So that could well have been the issue, but in fact the local community embraced it straight away as soon as the building started going up, as soon as they started to understand what it was we were doing. The danger is, over time, we may end up with the community saying, actually, we'd rather it was just normal, this school. It's too unusual. But at the moment, that isn't the position we're getting to.
Well, thanks. That was fantastic. It seems from the film, especially in your presentation, it's something of a kind of model, and I wonder if it's been taken up as a model anywhere, or whether you've been approached by many places to talk about this as a kind of, you know, being reproduced elsewhere. And I've just got a second part of the question. Is it, in terms of doing something like this, do you think really that a free school is the only way that you could do this now, or would there be any way of doing it through the local authority schools? I'll give you this.
Thank you. I might have to do the second part of the question because I've forgotten slightly the first part of the question. In terms of, I might have to come back to the first part of the question. Yeah, I think all of us wouldn't have claimed that we were supporters of the Free School Initiative at the point we started this. The school, actually, in terms of capital, they've sunk about 17 million into that building, and I don't think there's any way that our local council would have come up with that money. I don't think there's any way they have the money or would have seen that as being an obvious act. So in some ways I think the free school the initiative probably is the best way to do it. We looked at all of the different fundamentalists that were putting in free school bids and decided that although we were uncomfortable about it, as creative fundamentalists, we had a right to try and subvert this policy, which was exactly the approach we took. So I think actually there's some almost bottomless pockets in the DFE around free schools. So I think if you have an idea, I'm not sure it isn't the easiest way to get funded, but there may well be other ways. The first part of your questions.
It's just about whether this has been taken up as a model.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've had lots of people come and look at it and talk about it, and I'm aware of another couple of places that are discussing making bids around Creative Free School. But there are, inside the Free School Initiative, although it has all the baggage we just talked about, there are some really interesting models. So there's one in East London which I think is all about student voice, which is an absolutely fascinating thing about students talking and articulating their ideas, and the way in which students and pupils constantly are encouraged to sort of public speak about what they're doing and things. And some of these are sort of slightly peculiar ideas, but you can see the benefit they have immediately. So I think there is something, I'd hate to defend in any way Gove, but there's something quite fascinating about being brave enough to allow people to be experimental inside the system.
You really, really briefly touched on the fact that you're currently making a case for sort of filling that gap with the A-levels, and I wondered if you could just expand on that a bit, what your plan is for teaching A-levels in this sort of creative way, and how you would do that, and will that be more of a sort of hard sell, what subjects you'll teach, etc.
I think one of the questions for us is about the different kind of pedagogy, and if students have learned through this different model, how are they then going to? At the moment, they'll have to leave us and go into all of the other sixth forms in the city. And actually, Plymouth's a peculiar city. It's got 19 schools. Every one of them's got a sixth form, and most of the sixth forms have got fewer than 100 pupils. So you know, there's just their offer in each one of those sixth forms is terrible. Well, not terrible. I didn't say that. The offer in those sixth forms is limited and only made better because they bus people around, and that doesn't seem like a particularly good offer. One of the things we're thinking about is about how we do something which probably uses the International Baccalaureate. So we would want to pursue something which was more like a liberal arts agenda, and something which was more holistic than I think the idea of getting students to take 3 or 4 A-levels. We've also got lots of young people who, at the end of the GCSE, the first GCSEs, may well be more interested in vocational education of various different sorts. Now, obviously, if that's something which is to do with art and design, we potentially can support them inside the art college. But if it's something else, if it's dance or drama or music, then that isn't something that we support. And the kind of core students who we hope are going to go on and be doctors and lawyers and so on, and be creative doctors, and actually that's not a good idea, creative doctors and lawyers, but those people who are going to go on and do other kinds of careers, then the International Baccalaureate is probably the route. So, yeah. But again, we're kind of going back through the Free School Initiative because of the same reason, because we would get capital investment, and we wouldn't get capital investment if we just tried to start it ourselves.
Ali, be the first one not to. I've got a bit of this incredible
but I do have a quite contrary question in relation to this, and it got me thinking. Looking at the film, it really got me thinking about space and a kind of misuse of space, and relationships between a kind of misuse of space and maybe creativity or something like that. And I'm thinking back to finding little hidden corners in primary school, to taking over damp corridors when I did my painting degree, and things like that, places people didn't go. So the question is, within the school, are there places to hide, or are there places that, that other things can happen that are not, have not been designed into the school vision, I think.
Yeah, that...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. It's a really good point, and I think you're probably right. We might not have done. I wonder about being in a big open plan space is a bit like being in a city as well. I think it is possible to be anonymous and to hide in a big space, but I don't think we have really made many small spaces. I can think of small recording studio spaces we've got there, or the radio station, or various different things like that. But yeah, we probably project. Yeah. Well, in fact, they have been constructing an old caravan. They ripped apart an old caravan to put it around reception in order to make reception quieter. And that inside that space, there are probably lots of ways they could build dens. So it'd be a great idea.
To throw it too far there. It's not a question. It's more of an observation, and it's about that space and the way it's being used. And one of the things that I find really interesting, especially with students such as Christiana, who wrote a dissertation about new academy build architecture and using these stellar architects to create these kind of glass edifices and all the problems therein. What struck me immediately I got into that school was the fact that the kids were pasting up stuff on the windows, and I suppose that it just seemed to me there was a really nice kind of generosity about how you might kind of bastardize that space in a way. And so these really modernist spaces, we're putting some kind of furry carpets in and like odds and ends, and there didn't seem to be a sort of preciousness about it, which I thought, I know what you're saying, Annie, about the hidden spaces, but I also thought it was a very loose and generous idea about how those spaces might be co-opted for different activities without the kind of sanctions that often happen, and that was quite quite encouraging, I think, to see. Anybody over here want to catch?
I'm just very interested in joining up the conversation from this morning with this conversation about assessment, and because we're talking about the way assessment's been driving things the wrong way. If that's the reductive way of putting this morning's conversation, how are you dealing with that in this context?
To say it's my biggest anxiety in lots of ways, because the assessment model, getting students to be successful through the assessment model means that we're going to have to teach them how to game the assessment, and that hasn't been the model that we've been teaching them at all at the moment. We're fully aware of it, and there's lots of discussions about how we're going to approach that, but I think we're fairly uncomfortable about it. But there isn't another way forward. To some extent, the International Baccalaureate discussion we had a moment ago is another way that we could move, but we can't for those age 16 exams. So,
it says a lot. Such a It says a lot. It's such a wonderful model. And then your problem is this thing. It's this a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah. No, it does. I mean, it's the way in which they've learnt. We're going to have to completely teach them a different way in order to respond. So yeah, and to some extent, at the end, as I said, we've been leading the teaching by asking them, how would you know? How would you do it? Getting them to be outward looking. We are at the end going to have to say, right, these are the 10 facts you need to know. I suspect if we're going to hit the targets, but hopefully they'll have such a sound bedrock of knowledge that they'll be really easy to get those.
I think we've got one question over here, and then time for one more, and then we need to, I think.
Mine's just quick, but just in an ideal scenario, continuing from that, how would you assess them, ideally? Like, if you, in your school?
I don't. That's really interesting. I suppose. No, you're right to question me about that, because I certainly would have a critique of assessment, but I'm not sure I've thought through what the other model would be. We're trying to teach them in some ways to behave in a way that would be authentic in the rest of their lives. So the way in which you might be asked to do something in your work life and produce a report, the way in which you might be, you might need to discover something, and I think that rather than wanting them to have memorised and regurgitate, I think we'd be more interested in seeing them use a range of information in order to come up with another proposition, or something which involved a choice or a thought pattern, not just a passive repetition. But it needs more thinking.
That last question over there.
Thanks, Tim. I just wondering, could you say a little bit maybe about sort of staffing? Because I'm interested. Yeah.
That's one of the nice things actually. The moment it grows every year.
I send my CV. Yeah. No, but I am interested in the teachers you've got there, and and the difference there, and what their experience is, and are they subject-specific teachers, and how you get them on board. Are they on board? Is there friction? It's I'll be interested to say a couple of things about that.
Going all the way back to when we first did the public consultation, and so we had about 8 or 9 events where we invited people to come along, and big lecture theatre full of people. About 50% of the people who came to those events were teachers, desperate to see this thing happen and wanting to be part of it. So actually what we've found is whenever we've gone out to ad, is the most enormous quantity of people who've absolutely bought into the ethos and values of the institution before we ever get round to shortlisting them and seeing them. So in that way, the sell isn't that difficult. The actual reality of it, when they come in and they suddenly realise they're teaching in these big open plan spaces, and we suddenly dissolve the timetable in front of them and do something different just when they thought they knew what was going on, it's complicated and it's unsettling. And I think that has taken a while for some teachers to really get their heads around, and we've had some churn where people have just decided there was too much uncertainty in the teaching, let alone for the students. But largely there have been people who've really voted for it, really wanted to be in that kind of environment and have stuck with it. About subject specialists, absolutely.
Okay, that was our last question, but there'll be time to pick up on some of this in discussion later, because you've got a discussion breakout later this afternoon. But I think, like I said, another big thanks to Tim.